Hi there. This is George R. R. Martin coming to you from Santa Fe, New Mexico. Thank you for listening to my podcast. I thought I would talk to you a little today about A Feast for Crows and the fantasy series that it's part of, A Song of Ice and Fire, which some of you may be reading and others hopefully will pick up on in the near future. I get asked all the time where this series came from. I've been writing it now for more than a decade, something like a decade and a half. But if truth be told, I didn't really intend to write it. It all began back in 1991, at which time I was mostly working for Hollywood. I spent 10 years out in Hollywood working in television and film, roughly from the mid-'80s to the mid-'90s. But Hollywood work is not continuous. You get a job on a show, and it runs for a season, and it's canceled. You get a movie, you work on it for half a year, and then it's done. And so sometimes there are times between assignments. And in 1991, the summer of 1991, I was indeed between Hollywood assignments. And I thought I would get started on a novel. It had been 5 or 6 years since my last novel had come out. And I was anxious to keep my hand in as far as prose was concerned, because I began as a novelist and a short story writer. As much as I enjoyed working in television and film, books were my first love and are still my first love. So I wanted to continue to work in that field. And I had this science fiction novel called Avalon that I'd been thinking about for more than a decade. It was set in a future history that I had developed a lot in my short stories and novels way back in the 1970s, and I thought it would be a good continuation of that. And I had a lot of notes on it. I had the characters. I had some ideas for the plot. So I sat down in the summer of 1991. I began work on Avalon, and it was going pretty well. And then one day, this chapter came to me, this scene about a young boy going out with his father in the snows to see a man executed. And they find these direwolf pups. It was a medieval setting. I knew that. I knew it had a large cast of characters. And it seized hold of me, and I didn't know where it came from. I still don't know where it came from. But it came to me so vividly. I could see the scene. I could see the snow. I could feel the cold. I could see the blood when the sword took off the man's head, and feel the boy's feelings about this, because he was a young boy, and this was the first time his father had let him participate in this rite of adulthood and seeing an execution. So he was excited, but he was a little scared at the same time. And then the direwolf pups and the meaning of that, of course, became a major part of what he had to go through. Now, one thing I knew when this came to me is it wasn't part of Avalon. It had absolutely nothing to do with this science fiction novel that I was writing. But it was there, and it was so vivid that I knew I had to write it. So I put Avalon aside, and I wrote that chapter, which ultimately would become the first chapter of A Game of Thrones, which was, in turn, the first book of A Song of Ice and Fire. People sometimes say, this wrote itself, this book wrote itself, this story wrote itself. I've never had the experience of anything writing itself. But every once in a while, you will come across a chapter that you just seem to know it so well that it just seems to flow out of your fingers onto the page. And that's what happened with this chapter. It only took me a few days to get it down. And by the time I did have it down, I knew the chapter had to follow it, which would be from the viewpoint of a different person. So I went right on from that chapter to the next chapter. And before I knew it, I'd been working for several weeks on this new project, which at that stage didn't have a name yet. And it had nothing to do with Avalon. So the novel that I'd planned for so long went into the drawer where it has remained till this day. And instead I found myself writing this epic fantasy series. Although I didn't know it was a series at the time. In the beginning I thought maybe it was just a novella. But pretty soon I decided, no, given the number of characters and scales, it had to be a novel. And then I decided, well, maybe it was a trilogy. Maybe it was a series of novels. I knew I was really serious when I took time off and I drew a map of the world. Of course, I didn't finish it in 1991 because, as I said, I was on a break from Hollywood, and breaks from Hollywood didn't last. Toward the end of that summer, I had about 70 or 80 pages on the book, but my Hollywood agent called and said she had some meetings for me set up with the networks to pitch ideas for television shows, and that's not the sort of thing that you turn down if you're working in Hollywood. So I flew out and I pitched some ideas for television shows, and one of them was picked up. So the book that by then I was thinking of as Game of Thrones went in a drawer next to Avalon, and I took off a year and a half to write and then produce a pilot called Doorways for ABC. And then there were some other pilots. So it was a lot of time passed before I actually got back to the novel. Now that's dangerous for me. In the past, when I've had a work in progress and I've put it aside for a significant period of time, sometimes it goes cold on me. And I come back to it, and I don't know who the characters are anymore. I don't know where I was going with the plot, and I have great difficulty getting back into it. But that never happened with Game of Thrones. Even though something like 2-3 years passed before I could get back to it, all that time, while I was doing other things, while I was working in Hollywood, while I was writing movies, writing television pilots, producing those, the characters and the situations of A Game of Thrones continued to sort of haunt the back of my mind. Arya and Tyrion and Dany and Jon Snow and some of the other characters that I was so involved with who had come alive in this book. I would see scenes of them in my head. I would hear them talking to me when I was driving to and fro on the Los Angeles freeways. So finally, back in 1994, I believe it was, I finally took it out again and got back to work on it and gave it to my agents and said, let's see if anyone was interested in buying this. And fortunately, several people were interested in buying it, so next thing I knew, I had a deal, and I was finally able to step away from Hollywood. And to tell you the truth, I was getting pretty frustrated with Hollywood by that point in time, and work full-time on A Game of Thrones. And the rest, I guess, is history. The first book came out in 1996, and there have been 3 more since then. I'm now thinking to tell the entire story is going to require me 7 volumes, and 7 big volumes. Tolkien once said the tale grew in the telling when he was discussing Lord of the Rings, which of course had started out being just a simple little sequel to The Hobbit. And I know how he felt because that is exactly what happened with A Song of Ice and Fire. It's a big story, and it has grown in the telling. So A Feast for Crows is the 4th installment of that story, and I'm presently at work on the 5th part, A Dance with Dragons, which I hope to finish before the end of this year, but you'll have to